Lounging on a sun deck 30 stories above Miami's coastline, Mike adjusts the collar of his velour bathrobe. It's a gangster-style statement piece that screams Sicilian boss. Nearby, his attractive girlfriend basks in the sun, working on her tan, but secretly working for the FBI. Mike shoots her a look, a fleeting glance packed with meaning, as he swirls his cocktail. The ice clinks softly, a contrast to the tension that's simmering beneath the surface. Every movement, every detail of this rooftop act has to be flawless. The stakes couldn't be higher. Manuel Guzman steps into the room, exuding the cool confidence of a man tied to El Chapo Guzman himself, the world's most wanted drug lord. Manuel's eyes sweep the area, not just admiring the view, but checking out every detail of Mike's setup. He's here to judge, to decide if this mafioso is the real deal. But there is a glaring problem. Mike isn't from Palermo. He's from Philly, and he doesn't speak a word of Italian. And yet here he is trying to persuade El Chapo's right-hand man to agree to a deal that could change the drug trade forever. How will this play out? Find out in today's episode of The Infographics Show, the FBI agent who went undercover in a drug cartel. By the time FBI Special Agent Michael McGowan came face-to-face with Manuel Guzman, he was a seasoned veteran of the shadows. For a number of decades, he had infiltrated Italian mobsters, Russian syndicates, biker gangs, and corrupt unions, masterfully navigating the world of organized crime. Mike was the best in the business, one of the rare breed of law enforcement who thrived undercover, deep inside the world's most dangerous gangs. About 10% of FBI agents will go undercover at some point in their careers, but only a select few dedicate years, let alone decades, to living a double life. Mike did it for 30 years, taking down some of the biggest names in crime, often at a great risk to his own life. In the 1980s, Mike was a young cop working a bank robbery case when an FBI agent asked him if he'd ever considered joining the agency. Mike had a young family and he was struggling to make ends meet. The FBI offered double the pay. It was an opportunity too good to pass up. Without any specific training, he was thrown straight into the lion's den, tasked with posing as a gangster in Philadelphia's infamous Badlands. Back then, drug traffickers often transported their goods in cars and vans, outfitted with cleverly hidden secret compartments. Mike saw an opportunity. He pitched an audacious idea to his bosses. Why not set up a front company that specializes in building these contraband-safe vehicles? He'd be the one who sold them, and hopefully become a regular fixture in gangsters' lives. At that point, he had very little training in this kind of work, but he knew he'd be good at it. The key was always to do a lot more listening than speaking. Speaking could get you in trouble, and listening got you intel. So he set up that showroom selling these special cars and had a legitimate auto body company build the secret compartments. He had an informant put the word out to gangsters. If you wanted to buy a vehicle for your sketchy business, Mike was the guy to see. Soon, dealers and traffickers were lining up to get one of Mike's cars. He had so many of them coming to see him, he was sending 7 out of 10 away empty-handed. The lucky few who got keys to shiny new automobiles were the ones Mike thought were doing the most business. When they drove off the lot, the FBI tracked the car everywhere it went. A lot of guys went to prison. Mike quickly became a rising star in law enforcement, earning a reputation for his fearlessness and ingenuity. The FBI saw his potential and offered him an even bigger challenge, infiltrating organized crime and going toe-to-toe with mafia bosses. It was a dangerous proposition. Mike agreed, even though he had no idea how to act like the kind of person who does business with wise guys. All he knew was if you made a mistake, you could end up in a shallow grave. Still, he had to admit, he found this kind of work thrilling. What he needed was training, to look and sound like a first-rate criminal, to know what to say, to become authentic. So, as undercover FBI agents often do, he went to enlist the help of an informant, a real-life Italian-American mobster. That informant was Cosa Nostra captain-turned-informant, Big Ron Prevete. Prevete had been around the block. In fact, he'd been around it twice, starting his career in Philly as a highly corrupt cop. He was a mercenary who, after resigning from the force, went to work for the Philadelphia mob boss, Joey Merlino. He was a good earner and soon he became a made man, but eventually he flipped and started informing for the FBI, which is how he met Mike. He taught Mike everything he knew about being a mobster, from the way to talk and what to wear to how operations worked, and the two soon became the best of friends. And that's how Mike found himself in the position to take on Carmen D'Annunzio, better known as the Cheese Man. As Boston's mafia underboss, D'Annunzio was involved in everything from extortion rackets to smuggling contraband, including cheese. Mike was asked to go undercover and put him behind bars. The plan was simple. D'Annunzio knew guys who owned a big dirt farm, but their product contained toxic chemicals, so they couldn't sell it. An informant got word back to the FBI, and a plan was formed. To infiltrate the operation, Mike posed as a corrupt Massachusetts state officer who, for the right price, would dispose of the contaminated dirt after a bogus inspection. But playing the part of a crooked dirt inspector wasn't as simple as it sounded. Before stepping into the role, Mike spent months in what he would call dirt school, learning everything he could about the science of soil. On the day the deal was done, Mike screeched to a halt in his truck, got out, and urinated on one of the tires. The mobsters thought he was a nut and definitely not undercover FBI. He took the dirt off of D'Annunzio's hands and collected his bribe. And that's how the big cheese ended up behind bars. The whole case had taken just 6 months, a fairly short time for an undercover case involving the arrest of a major player. But it wasn't always like that. In one high-stakes operation, Mike posed as the getaway driver for a bank robbery. Unknown to the crew, the FBI was already waiting at the bank ready to spring the trap. The case was over in just a few days, but not before an informant helped plant Mike's name as a candidate for the job, securing his spot in the gang. It wasn't always plain sailing. On one occasion, Mike had infiltrated the Boston mob when the FBI got a call saying it was very likely that his cover had been blown. Mike convinced the FBI to let him carry on, but on the condition he only met the mobsters out in the streets, with agents hiding nearby. When Mike turned up for the next meeting, one of the mobsters motioned for him to go inside the social club where they always hung out. Mike walked into a room, thinking this could be the end of his life. Sitting at a table was the boss, Bobby Luisi. He told Mike he had something serious to discuss, but they should go down to the basement. Thoughts raced through Mike's head. This was it. If he ran, he'd likely be shot, or at least he'd ruin a long and expensive case. When they got down to the basement, rather than pull out a gun, Luisi said he wanted bigger shipments of cocaine that Mike had already arranged. Luisi was later sent down for trafficking. Luisi was later asked about that day in the basement. He said that he thought Mike was being followed by the FBI, not actually FBI, so that they'd taken him there to protect him. Mike later admitted that going into that building was a rookie mistake, one that he'd never have made in his more seasoned years. In undercover work, mistakes can be fatal, and you are incredibly lucky if you get the chance to learn from them. He had plenty of practice. Mobsters, he said, don't like strangers, but when you offer them deals with serious money, they can't resist it. He built a career on the back of greed. There was no one better than him at undercover work in all of the USA. Although it has to be said that his glory was tainted somewhat when he and another undercover agent befriended a serial killer. Mike and the agent were chatting, and the agent accidentally sat on his phone. The last number rang, the number of the killer. And Mike and the agent were talking about putting him behind bars. The killer, who brazenly told the FBI to back off, remains free to this day. Despite their best efforts, the Bureau never gathered enough evidence to make the case stick. But mostly, Mike was a star in the FBI. After infiltrating 3 Cosa Nostra families, he went after the Russians, but his greatest accomplishment was what he did to El Chapo. Mike was nearing the end of his career as Chapo became the most wanted man in America, earning billions from drugs and capable of extreme violence. He was hiding out in the mountains of Sinaloa, surrounded by the firepower of a small military, yet Mike and the FBI still thought they could get him with some solid undercover work. This is where Manuel in the snazzy Miami condo came into the story. By 2010, the years had caught up with Mike. His days of playing the young, ambitious trafficker were behind him. Balding and gray, he no longer fit the role of the up-and-coming trafficker. Instead, he had to step into a new persona, the big shot, the boss. As always, the FBI had a man on the inside. The informant told them he could get Mike a meeting with the highest echelons of the Sinaloa cartel. All he wanted in return was all the properties the FBI had seized from him. This man he was talking about was El Chapo, so naturally the FBI agreed. The informant told them El Chapo's latest trafficking ambition wasn't about selling drugs to the United States. He planned to set up a pipeline from Mexico to Europe, a continent where cocaine was in higher demand than ever before. This shift marked a bold expansion of his empire and a dangerous new challenge for law enforcement. The informant went to Mexico and told the cartel he had guys who were willing to do business and build that pipeline. The guys were Mike and a few other undercover agents. They were pretending to be a Sicilian crime organization. They wanted a meeting with the Mexicans, but on neutral territory, a high-end condominium apartment in Miami in the USA. Mike needed a Sicilian Italian-speaking agent who could pass as mafioso, but the only guy available at the FBI had just retired. It was decided that Mike would pose as the aging head honcho, the boss who quietly commanded respect from the shadows. Meanwhile, 3 other undercover agents, fluent Spanish speakers, would take the lead and do most of the talking. If Mike so much as uttered a word, the entire operation could unravel. The risk was high, but when it came to acting, Mike was the best in the business. He knew how to sell the role without a single misstep, and that is exactly how it had to go down. The condo was beautiful. From 30 floors up, you could see the Atlantic Ocean stretch for miles and miles. They fitted the room with recording equipment, video cameras, and microphones. It was staged to look like the kind of place a Sicilian gangster would stay. The plan was for the TV to be playing soccer when the Mexicans arrived, because that's what an Italian would do. Everyone involved had a script to follow. They knew where every camera was hidden, so if the Mexicans started wandering, they could guide them back to the right place. None of this would mean anything if the Mexicans during the negotiations weren't seen and heard. One of the agents was to be the master of transportation. He could get contraband anywhere in the world. He understood all the shipping routes and the international transportation systems in Europe, so he would be the one telling the Mexicans about logistics. He looked the part too, sporting designer sunglasses and a breezy, colorful shirt that captured the Miami aesthetic. Then they had Antonio, who would handle the ports in Europe. When the large shipments of cocaine are heading across the world, you need guys who have friends in the ports, where you can pay people to turn a blind eye to your cargo. The truth was, Antonio had connections with law enforcement at these ports. The third guy was Mike's pretend underling, Patricio, who was fluent in both Italian and Spanish. The narrative was that Mike was getting on in years and was considering hanging up his gloves. Patricio was the next in line to take the throne. The cover story was airtight. Mike trusted Patricio like family, as if they were bound by blood. At the meeting, Patricio would handle all the talking and report back to Mike. The dynamic of the boss sitting in the background was important because this is how it often works. The Mexicans needed to believe that Mike's underlings were not only loyal but also mortally afraid of crossing him. If they had ever the faintest suspicion that Mike wasn't the man in charge, or worse, that his crew didn't fear him, they would have walked away and flown straight back to Sinaloa. Representing El Chapo was Manuel Jesus Guzman, Chapo's trusted relative. Mike sent an undercover agent pretending to be a part of the Sicilian mob to pick him up at Miami International Airport. Back at the condo, everyone was nervous, but that was good. Overconfidence in these situations can lead to mistakes. As Manuel was on the way, Mike went to the bathroom and decided to slip into what he described as a gaudy purple velour bathrobe. He'd already been given a $5,000 suit to wear to look the part, but he felt the bathrobe was more authentic for a sleazy, rich Italian gangster. Everyone laughed when he walked out of the bathroom, but at least it calmed their nerves. Manuel was in his smart suit, looking like a regular guy about to do regular business, and walked into the room. Mike was out on the sun deck, drink in hand, catching some rays. He expected Manuel to introduce himself, but for some reason, he wouldn't go outside. It turned out he was extremely afraid of heights. He stayed in the corner of the room, which wasn't great because he was out of the camera's line of sight. Mike decided to go into the main room and briefly shake Manuel's hand. As the script demanded, no sooner than he introduced himself, he walked back out onto the sun deck. Mike's underling Patricio told Manuel that Mike wasn't a happy man. He didn't want to negotiate with anyone but El Chapo himself. After all, he was the boss of a major Italian crime family. This was an insult. So, Mike left Manuel sitting on the sofa for a couple hours as he hung out on the deck with his girlfriend. This was a young FBI agent who looked like the kind of girl a wealthy crime boss would date. Occasionally, Patricio would go out and whisper something in Mike's ear, and Mike would either nod or shake his head. At the start, Manuel didn't like this one bit. For a while, he seemed uneasy, looking like he might leave. At one point, Mike peered behind him and saw that Manuel was slapping the hand of Patricio like they had just made the deal of the century. It wasn't until hours later that Mike finally walked back inside. Even then, he kept his distance, never addressing Manuel directly. Instead, he relied on his guys to relay information into his ear, obviously in Italian that he didn't understand. Manuel laid his final offer on the table. They would start with 11,000 pounds, and if everything went smoothly, much more would follow. Patricio leaned in, whispered the proposal back to Mike. Without saying a word, Mike shook his head. "No," Patricio said. "That's too much for the first shipment, too much risk. Why would Mike be turning down a huge amount of cocaine that could see the cartel members going away for years?" The answer was he was just playing it smart. He had to try to look as authentic as possible. In negotiations, you rarely agree to the first offer, and if he had, Manuel might have smelled a rat. Mike said he was setting up a system that would last for many years, so why push it before they tested how well it works? A smaller amount was fine. Manuel, a man from farming stock, agreed. After hours at the negotiating table and quite a few drinks, he was having the time of his life, and it didn't look like he wanted to leave. A few months later, the Mexicans were sending test loads through Mike's phony pipeline. These weren't drugs, they were crates of fruits shipped on Chapo's Mexican vessels so the Sinaloans could see if the Sicilians could get them through once they reached Europe. Of course, they did get through. The Sicilians weren't lying when they said they were good at their jobs. When enough trust had been built, Mike the Sicilian presented El Chapo with an offer, a thank you for his help. He called it an escape hatch plan. He said that he could safely smuggle El Chapo to Italy, far away from the many law enforcement authorities after him in Mexico and the US. Chapo declined, but still, he liked these guys. One of his men once told Mike that El Chapo respected his discipline. Chapo later offered Mike a money laundering deal. He said he had a little bit of cash to move and there was a good cut in it for him. By a little bit, he meant $500 million. Mike turned it down. Again, turning down a deal gave Mike and his guys a look of authenticity. And had they gotten involved with laundering, it could have negatively affected the trafficking setup, which had now taken almost 3 years and a lot of taxpayer money. It wasn't until 2012 that Chapo's guys shipped out about 700 pounds of top-grade cocaine, all of which was seized by the Spanish National Police, who were working with Mike and the FBI. This seizure meant Chapo and 8 of his executive board members could be charged in the USA when the time came. So when Chapo was eventually arrested in Mexico, Mike's case was one of the reasons he could be extradited to the US, and that's where he remains today. But his legacy lives on. His family and associates continue to fuel the American drug market, while European cocaine consumption has soared to staggering new heights, far beyond what anyone imagined back in 2012. What do you think was the most daring move Agent Mike McGowan made in taking down El Chapo? Think you could have kept your cool if you were in Mike's shoes? Let us know in the comments. Now you need to watch all the insane ways El Chapo has escaped prison, or have a look at most brutal torture methods by Mexican cartels.